Should we start?
Okay.
All right, Nana, thanks again for being here. This is now our fourth conversation, our
Yeah.
fourth episode, and it's the first one that we're doing since having released the first three to the public. And man, I'll just speak for myself. The response has been so overwhelmingly positive and kind, and I guess just further reinforces our original hypothesis, which is how valuable these sort of conversations are for the world, and especially for young people like myself who may not have someone like you to guide them and share their experience. So thanks again for being here. It really means the world to me, and now I know it means so much to so many other people.
Well, it's a wonderful thing for me to leave this to my family, but I'll tell you, I'm shocked. Shocked. I was going to say surprised, but that's not strong enough to realize that so many people seem to be so interested in the conversation that you and I are having.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It surprised me at first, and then when I thought about it, it really doesn't surprise me at all once I sort of peel back that layer and ask why. But regardless, I want to dive way back into your early years. You were born in 1929, so I believe that was the year of the economic crash, right?
Yes, it was. I was born in June, and the crash was in October, I think.
So I take it you don't really have a great memory of that.
That I don't remember at all, but I do remember when I was 8, 9, and 10 years old that things were going on. And of course, I was very much aware of FDR being president, and I was very much aware that he ran for a fourth term, I believe, right? That was very unusual. And I was still, what was I, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old?
You know, I was maybe 8 or 9 years old during the recession of 2008. And I have to give my parents so much credit for not ever really showing me or making me aware or feel the pressure of what was going on in the world. I'm really lucky that my life didn't change that much. I know a lot of people didn't have a choice, but I always think back and sort of subconsciously thank my parents for never letting me feel the weight of all of that. And I'm curious what it was like for your parents.
It was a much stronger reaction. It was maybe the recession itself then in 1929 was very severe. I think the 2008 was not as devastating as the one before was. My parents married, I think, in 1925. I was born in 29. And both had been working before I was born, so they had some money saved, but they had invested in the stock market, as had my grandfather, my mother's father, also had invested in the stock market. And when that crash came, everything went down to zero just about, so it was very devastating. And I know my grandfather took it very hard, and my parents were young, and they were working, and they didn't put all their money in the stock market, but they had some cash, and so it was a bad time for to live through it as a newborn infant. I didn't know. I wasn't aware of anything like that at the time. But I do remember as I was growing up that there was conversation in the house about the stock market and everything else.
You said your grandfather took it very hard. Can you elaborate on that more?
Well, he was older. He was old. And I think a crash like that was very hard on the elderly at the time. And I just remember that he took it hard, and I wasn't old enough, really. I think he passed away when I was 11 years old. So it was, I just remember that it was something that was hard for him to deal with. And my mother would say, I recall, that's it, no more, no more, not going to go through that again, right? And so what happened many years later, when she was out working with the dress industry, my father had already, did he pass away? I'm not too sure right now, but it was so many years later. One of her co-workers was investing in the stock market. And so she said to my mother, my father must not have been here because my mother was able to go with her friend to the stock broker that my friend was using. And so my mother was kind of, you want to call it sucked in, but she was so very cautious. And she would always say to me, I remember this so vividly, when you invest in the stock market, says you put some money in it and you pretend that you have not got that money anymore. It was money that you threw away or you don't count it anymore. It was spent. So that whenever she would look to see how her stocks were doing, sometimes I know I was with her, because I wasn't married, I lived with her. And so she said, she would laugh. She would listen to a stock market report, and if the stock she had went down, she would almost laugh like, haha, right? And if it went up, and that was fine too. And that has been her whole attitude regarding the stock market for the rest of her life.
Wow, that's a pretty robust attitude, right? You put the stock money in and that money no longer belongs to you. It's money that you don't have anymore, right? And if things go up, great. If things go down, you weren't calculating your financial situation based upon that.
Right. And she grew to have a very close relationship with her stockbroker through her friend. It was the same stockbroker that she used for the rest of my mother's life as well. And so I got to know him too, because sometimes I would go with my mother when she went. And she really relied on him, and he was a very positive influence on her life, yes.
How long after the crash do you think it was before she had begun to reinvest again, when she had that first meeting with her friend?
Let me see. The crash was 29. I was married in 58. I would say 25, 30 years before she really, invested a little, never the whole thing, that's for sure.
I got to imagine that must have been a very common occurrence for people who were her age when the crash happened. I'm guessing it took a long time for them to sort of regain that trust in the markets, and probably maybe even contributed to a more bearish market for a while, right? It takes a while for those effects to fade away and for people to say, okay, maybe I'm going to try this again.
When that crash happened, it was a crash. It went from whatever the stock was to zero. It went zoom to nothing, That didn't happen with the 2008. I mean, the stock market suffered, but it just went down. It didn't just crash and having nothing. That was quite a time.
Do you think your father had similar opinions?
My father had nothing to do with it. He wasn't interested in it. He couldn't care less.
I see. So your mother was the investor, and your father was managing the restaurant.
Yes.
Gotcha. And before I move on, your grandfather, who was older when the crash happened and passed away maybe 10 or 12 years later, what did he do for work?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Because I was quite young at the time. And when I do begin to remember him, he was not working anymore.
I see. So he was retired during the time of the crash. Wow. So, I mean, his whole retirement fund, I can't imagine how scary that must have been. Well, moving forward a couple of years, I want to talk about World War II. And still, I know you were still very young when all this happened, so I'm not sure what you remember. But I'm curious, as an Italian living in the United States, when Mussolini joined forces with Hitler and the Axis powers Is that something, was that a surprise to people in the United States? Did you feel any reverberation from that?
I just remember that all of my parents' friends who were Italian were just not happy that Mussolini was involved in this war with Germany. I mean, this was really bad, 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 right? And so they were really not happy at all.
Did you or your parents know anyone who fought in that war? Was there any people that were close to you that were drafted and fought?
There must be. There must have been. I just don't remember. Because, well, for example, my father was not of draft age. He was older,
Okay.
and his friends also were a little older. I don't remember any of my father's and mother's family group that were eligible for the draft.
Interesting. So your parents' end sort of maybe just missed the cutoff, and your
Yes.
generation was maybe just too young.
Yes.
I see. I see. And people that were a few years older, I mean, really only a few years older than you, that ended up getting drafted. Do you
Yes.
remember what it was like when they returned? I'm trying to think of where you would have been in your life when
well,
they did.
then that reminds me of one group of my father's friends whose son was drafted and he died. And I know the effect that it had, because these were very close friends of my parents. And I don't think the father especially ever really recuperated from that loss. So this was the closest that I came to feeling anything in terms of the seriousness and the sadness and the loss of something personal.
Where were you when the war ended and the troops came back? Were you in high school?
Yes, I think so. I started high school in 1942. When did I think that was around the time the war ended, yes.
Okay.
Because I do remember the celebration of, the war has ended, the war has ended.
Tell me about that.
Well, I also remember the nuclear bombing of Japan and the horror that filled everybody with, and so many people died with one bomb. This was a very big, big thing. England was being bombed all through the war. The damages were done. People were dying. Cities were being devastated. But the nuclear bomb
The atomic bomb.
the atomic bomb was, the result was unimaginable. I do remember the disbelief of that occurrence.
Yeah, tell me what that was like in as much detail as you can remember.
Well, what I can remember the most was the bombs were dropped, and shortly after, Japan gave in and the war ended.
Was this a huge surprise to people? Were the dropping of the two atomic bombs a huge surprise to everyday people in the United States, or was it more publicly acknowledged that there
No.
was a race for this technology?
I think it came as a huge surprise, a shock. That's what it was, a big surprise and a shock that it took place.
Hmm. And was the surrender of Japan expected or unexpected?
Well, I think it was almost expected after that. Germany had already given up.
Hmm.
Japan gave up afterwards. After that, that was the main occurrence that preceded the giving up.
Do you think there was any tension between Japanese living in the United States and the rest of the United States?
I'm sure there was. Oh yes, in fact, on the West Coast there were Japanese had to go live in camps, the Japanese camps during the war. Yes, there was. And Italians too, with Mussolini being on the other side. But I don't think it was as severe as it was with the Japanese people here.
You talked for a second about the celebrations when the war ended. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It was, I don't have all the details in my head. I was a young adult. I was a very young adult, and I remember the great sense of relief that it was for everyone that the war had ended. Great, great sense of relief.
Now, this sort of celebration and unity was, I'm guessing, when the war ended. Is that the same time that the troops came home, or is this sort of an extended celebration that went on?
No, I wasn't extended, but what was extended was when the troops came home. They just didn't come home 1, 2, 3. It covered a period of time that they were coming back, and of course FDR was the president then, and so he was revered by so many people.
Was it
That's why
FDR or Truman?
FDR.
Okay. Yeah, I can't imagine being in New York City during that time. I mean, do you remember, were there parades?
I just remember that people were celebrating all over. They were just celebrating all over that it was over, 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 and that the men were coming back. We're getting our men back.
Now, being at home during the war, did you experience any sort of rationing or drives? What did the war effort look like for those on American soil?
There was rationing. I know certain foods. I don't remember. I think sugar was one of the rationed foods that we got coupons, a certain number of coupons, and when those were used, that was it. You couldn't buy it anymore. And I think there were a couple of other things, but I don't remember what they were. I do remember that my mother had a very favored aunt who was in Italy at the time of the war, and they exchanged letters, and so things were discussed in the letters about how life was like during wartime in Italy, and from what I seem to remember, when invasions took place, the Italian people were very happy to see the Americans, and I didn't think it was what you'd expect if an enemy came into your territory, So I don't know just how the majority of the people felt about the war that they were involved in. But to go back to the letters, my mother would, knowing that they were having a hard time with certain foods and other things, my mother would send coffee. That was the number one food that I remember. And she would also be sending some clothing and other aspects to the things that they were finding very hard to get.
And her aunt and her aunt's family in Italy, do you think that they were living in fear more than you were in New York City, or do you think it was a similar?
I don't think so. They were from northern Italy, and the invasions that started with the Americans invading Italy was from the south. So in the north, they weren't. I didn't get the feeling that they were fearful like the southern Italian people might have been. I think that they just suffered some hardships in terms of the political and economic situation in the country.
They were just suffering from fascism.
Yes.
So for those of us who have not lived through and experienced war times, what would you tell us? What sort of advice would you give to people about, or not even advice? What was it like for you living through a war?
I wasn't experiencing anything. My life here was not a life in wartime. We weren't bombed. We weren't really experiencing basic hardships. I don't feel that we were really that deprived.
So at home things were pretty much you felt relatively unaffected by it.
Yes, maybe my parents were cautious in not exposing me to anything. I don't know. My life ran pretty normally. I went to school. I had 3 meals a day. I had a bed to sleep in. I mean, I had a very comfortable life. I was happy, and my family was a happy family. And we had relatives nearby, which we socialized with a good deal. My life was basically normal. I didn't experience the things that people in a war torn zone would feel. That this wasn't a war torn zone.
And when the younger gentlemen who came back on and were on the GI Bill went to school, what was that like? Did you have were you in class
Oh
with
yeah,
older
now
gentlemen?
that I experienced the difference. I had gone to an all-girl high school, and now I was going to college, and I went to a co-ed college, and not only were there boys in the classroom, which, by the way, was where I met my husband in one of those classes, and he was on my age, just maybe a year older, because he was too young to be drafted. He was not drafted. But in that classroom were men who came back from the war, and they were 5 and 6 years older than I was, because they were drafted when they met the draft age at the time. I didn't. My age group was much lower. So here they came back, and having come from a high school with no boys, went to a college with boys, not boys, men, and got a lot of attention. Wow, that was quite a thing. I wasn't even interested in my husband then, because he was just a kid compared to these men that were coming back from the war. And they gave me a lot of attention. Well, I preened like a bird with great feathers.
So you were in class not only with boys your own age, but also with like war heroes.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Wow.
yes.
That
And I
must,
dated them.
and you dated them.
I dated them. How about that? I didn't date my husband. I mean, I wasn't, he was just a kid over there. Yes, I did.
I can't imagine being my grandfather going to college and having to compete with all of these war heroes 5 and 6 years older. That sounds like it would have
Yeah,
sucked.
and that's where he was. That's just how it was for him.
Do you remember any sort of disdain from the younger men towards
No,
those?
because he got along well with everyone. He really did. And he got along well with these men returning too. I mean, he was friends with them. He enjoyed being with them, and I guess maybe I don't know, maybe when men got together they shared experiences. I can't tell you, I don't know. But he was friendly with everyone in that group.
That's good. And how did your relationship with Grandpa start? Were you classmates? Were you friends?
Oh, well, we started in the French class. I think I may have mentioned this, because I think I told you this. He thought that Monsieur Baudin gave me an A because I was a girl. What Tom didn't know, he didn't know me well at all at that time. But what he didn't know was that when I went into that French class from high school, I came with a little more French than the usual high school graduate, because my father came from very northern Italy, very near the French border, and could speak French, and his very close friends were Swiss. When they visited us, they all spoke Italian, but when they found out that I was studying French in high school and then in college, at home when they visited, we spoke in French all the time. And that really built up my French conversation and pronunciation. And I remember once asking one of those friends, we were on a walk, and I said to him, when we speak in French, do you know that I'm not French? Do I have an... And he says, there's a very little accent. So I was quite fluent in French. And then I go to college, and here I am, and we wrote compositions, and I was fluent. And I didn't know what to write about in a composition. And I had a high school French teacher who would give us dictation almost every day. And her dictation were always little funny stories. Well, I remembered them, and my compositions were all on these little funny stories. So I guess Monsieur Baudin must have appreciated my little sense of humor. And so I did well in his class, but Tom didn't know that. He just knew that I got an A, and he said it's because I was a girl.
Did he get an A?
I don't think so.
So,
But if he didn't get an A, he got definitely a B or B plus because he was a very good student also.
and so you were classmates and then friends. How long did you guys have a platonic relationship before you started to date?
Well, he was a psychology major, as was I. So over the 4 years, we had similar classes. I knew him for quite a long time. And it wasn't until the senior year, but I'd known him. I hadn't dated him, but I knew he was another person in my class. But in the senior year, I think we became more friends, and so that when we graduated, we knew each other very well. We were good friends.
So your romantic relationship started towards the end of your college years?
Yeah, and maybe even beyond, because we continued, and it really didn't get that serious till later on.
So when you graduated, did you sort of go along different paths?
Yes, I went to graduate school. I think I may have mentioned this. I went to Cornell, and he went to work because as he was in psychology, but was interested in science, and he went to work at a lab in one of the big hospitals in Manhattan. And as I said, I went to Cornell. He came for a weekend to visit me at Cornell. And at the end of that year, I came back and I started to work. And he then started his master's program at Rutgers. Well, he went into the Army first. He was drafted, went into the Army, and that was the Korean War, but he never saw fighting. He never, and after his service was over, then he went to Rutgers for his master's and then PhD.
So he was drafted. Was that what? Why was he drafted? What was the war?
I think it's the Korean War.
And did that totally turn your life upside down when he was drafted?
No, because I was busy. I was working. We knew each other well, but we didn't have a continuing relationship. Whenever he was around, he'd give me a call and we'd see each other, and we kept in touch on and off. But it wasn't until he started his graduate work that, and
things started to evolve.
It took him a few years, He had to do his master's, followed by the PhD. It must have taken him 4 or 5 years.
Do you think it turned his life upside down to be drafted? I know he never saw combat, but how common was it for a guy his age to be drafted? Do you think it was?
No, it was very common.
Okay. And do you think that people that loved him and were around him were nervous that he would see battle when he was drafted, or even after being drafted?
I wasn't part of his life. I didn't know his family then. I didn't know anything about them. I didn't meet them until he was almost through with his PhD.
I wonder how scary it is to get that letter, or if it was so common if it was so common to be drafted and still such a minuscule chance of seeing battle that when you got drafted, you weren't thinking, "Oh, I'm going to war."
All I can say is that when I went to Cornell, one of the graduate students with my professor was drafted, just like Tom, and that was how I came to be offered the job of the director of the speech clinic, because that was what he was doing. So he was drafted. I got the job at the school while I was working on my master's. And Tom also got drafted more or less the same time. So I don't know how common or uncommon. I just know two episodes there that I can recall.
And so when that gentleman was drafted and you got the job, was that you got the job permanently or you got
For
the
the
job?
year that I was there,
Okay. Was he guaranteed the job when he came back or no?
I have no idea
Okay.
what he did. When he
Sure.
left, I don't know if he came back because I was just there for the year and
Yeah.
I left.
How lucrative of an opportunity was that for you?
The job? Oh,
Yeah.
it was very minimal payment for me. It was just the honor and prestige of, getting that little job.
Did you already feel pretty like you'd found a good groove in the speech
No,
department?
it was a minimal. It wasn't a super active, but it was created. It was there for any of the students who needed it, and someone had to oversee it.
And when that year was up, where did you pivot from there?
Nothing. I left, and I have no idea what they did and who they appointed after that.
Well, I want to change topics for a second and talk about New York City. And, people always refer to it as the melting pot of all of these different cultures. But I know that it didn't always used to be a melting pot. I think at first, maybe before it had started to melt, there was maybe more unofficial borders and, this culture lived here. Your husband grew up in the Lower East Side or amongst a lot of Italian and Jewish people. You were in Astoria with maybe more Irish people. Do you feel like growing up there was you knew what culture, what type of people lived where? And do you feel like it was already beginning to melt and cultures were blending together?
I never felt that I lived in an Italian neighborhood. I'm sure the people who lived in certain sections of Manhattan, I can't think of it now, that were Italian, might feel that. And I think the people in Boston, the North End, are all very much Italian and aware of that. But I never lived in a place where everything around me was Italian. So if anything, because we had other groups living with us, I know that I felt among certain people, certain reservations when it came to Italian people. I'm being very kind when I say reservations, and I was very much aware of that. But that began even earlier in my childhood. So I didn't feel that sense of comfort of living in the same kind of community as my parents were.
I see. And do you think that your husband had a different experience because he was in maybe a neighborhood that had more Italians?
Oh yes, definitely. He was totally unaware of resentment toward him because of his Italian background. And he couldn't understand initially how I grew up with feelings such as I had. And so when he did experience it, it hit him very hard. And it wasn't until he was a professor in college and was up from assistant professor to full that he wasn't getting the promotion constantly. And he realized the reason why. And as I said, it hit him very bad, very bad. He had a heart attack, as a matter of fact,
Wow.
at that time. But he recuperated, and he finally got to full professor, but he didn't get it with the backing of his department. He got it with the backing of the chemistry department, because a lot of his work was biochemistry, but he was in a biology department. But it was the biochemists who knew him and knew his work that put him on the slate and went up the ladder to full professor. And when he became full professor, he made it his business as much as he could to help any of the other assistant professors who were facing the same thing that he did. And he spent over 10 years of his life helping these people. at no cost. I mean, he got nothing for that, but he felt that the people, the professors, the assistant professors who weren't being promoted in their own respective departments, it wasn't only science, it was in everything else, they couldn't talk. They because if they made a fuss, they were put down. But they couldn't do anything to himself, because he was full professor. They couldn't pull him down. So he was the only one who could speak up and help these people without paying a price for it. And so over the years, he organized a very strong group of people, and I won't go through the details, but there was a suit, a legal suit against the city of New York for prejudice against Italians and not getting promotions and not getting, whatever they were asking for. And it finally came before a judge. I'll never forget this. I'll never forget it. The judge was Judge Cotlet Moore. Oh, dear me, it'll come back to me. I know the name well. She was an African-American woman who had been working in Washington, D.C., and now accepted a position as some Supreme Court judge, whatever, in New York, and she was the judge for this trial. There were 13 defendants. My husband, of course, was helping them. He wasn't a defendant, but he was helping them. Their lawyer was pro bono as far as they were concerned, but for the trial, there was a lot of legal work. And to make a long story short, believe me, the Constance Baker Motley, Judge Constance Baker Motley.
Good memory.
Right? And she heard all cases. There was the attorneys for the city of New York. It was like David and Goliath, right? David and Goliath. This was the first time that a David in legal world in the United States where David won. And the judge listened to everyone, and she told them that she wanted the chancellor to appear, and the lawyer said, well, she has a very busy schedule and she's not able to come. And the judge said, you will get her here on Monday. This was a Friday. I was there and I heard and saw. You make sure she gets here on Monday, and if she doesn't come, I will send 2 deputies out to bring her here personally. And so she came on Monday, and she was questioned, and she had no qualms whatsoever in denying the prejudice. I couldn't believe it. I mean, how could she actually admit it? And the judge gave all of the 13 defendants everything that they asked for, plus the back pay. So the full professorship, and there was one person who was it? I don't recall it. He was connected with Queens College, but as not as a professor, but as a dean of something, and he got that too. Every single one got exactly what they wanted. It was an unbelievable victory, and when it was over, Tom had written a letter to his board, which I have framed. Here. I found it in some of the effects that he had, and I framed it. He had written to his board saying, I'm retiring as president of the Higher Education and Legal Fund. And I want to say that when I started, these were my goals, 1, 2, and 3. And the last, of course, was getting through the trial. He said, I have now accomplished all these goals, so I now pass it on to the leadership to someone else. And I can't tell you what a relief it was for me. And the reason was, I don't think anybody thought about it, but I worried about it for 10 years that he was the leader. If anyone,
Afterwards?
no, while
During? It
while
was a
he was,
10-year process?
yeah, oh yes, this,
Wow.
well, the it all led, there was one thing, then another,
Okay.
then another, then another, and it led finally to the court case. And I was so afraid that someone along the way would sue Tom. I had what kind of insurance did I had? I had fire insurance, house insurance, whatever insurance, but I didn't have insurance for a suit. And when he retired, I was, what a relief that now they can't come to sue him for any of the actions that were taken over those 10 years. And one, just to show you the caliber, one was the chairperson of the phys ed department. And he had written the book on physical education that was being used by almost all the colleges and universities in the country, and they still were denying him full professorship. He got the full professorship just like all the others.
Wow.
It was quite an accomplishment, and that tells you something about my husband. Tom was always there when you needed help. Always. You could count on him.
Wow. What an inspiring story. That's incredible. It's especially incredible to think about how this story started when you mentioned that he didn't necessarily grow up experiencing that same, or at least being aware of that same, whatever you want to call it, discrimination, prejudice, feelings. He didn't experience that maybe based on the neighborhood that he was in. And it wasn't until later in life that he started to feel those effects. Right. And so what was your biggest emotion throughout that 10-year journey?
I was with him all the way. For those 10 years, he had to raise money to support all these things that had to be done. Everything you do takes money. And he was having events, for, I can't think of the word, to gain money. That's how, one of the reasons Mary Mancini and Mario Taka would come and do the performing arts. Now, Mary is a world-renowned soprano, and Mario, it was the winner of the gold prize in accordion in France. He was the winner. I mean, these are people who were very well known and established in their professions, and they always came to help Tom in any of the events, the dinners and such that were for donations for this cause. And so I knew everything that was going on. Tom was, he would keep me abreast of the problems that he was facing, and there were so many, and couldn't believe it. I could believe it easily because I grew up with this. He did not until he was denied full professorship. That's when he began to be more aware of what was going on. So it was an enlightenment. I didn't mention, while he was doing all this at the college, he established a series of talks. It's too bad that when I'm talking about it, I don't always remember the names. I can't remember the title of this series of talks, but he founded these talks, and they were all given by guest speakers who were Italian and well known in their fields. He had Mayor of New York at the time as a speaker. He had the president of the law school at Yale as a speaker in his talk.
From Yale?
From Yale. I mean, I can go down and down. He always had somebody that was really at the top of the line of their subject as their guest speaker. The Distinguished Lecture Series, that was the title. This was the Distinguished Lecture Series that he founded at Lehman College, and it was for Italians. I was about to say something else, but it left me.
That's incredible. So it sounds like he really started a movement in his community that snowballed and became this bigger thing afterwards. That's incredible that he had the mayor of New York come and speak. It sounds like there was a lot of support behind this initiative. When he retired at the end of this 10-year journey, was he able to fully disconnect from that? What was his life like in retirement following such an intense road?
I think that he was satisfied with what had been accomplished, and he was happy to let go. He was happy to. Now I remember what I just forgot. When he would be planning who would be the next speaker, when he was still actively working and was involved with this distinguished lecture series, he would say to me, he would go down a list of people that he was thinking of asking to be the next guest speaker. And I would say to him, my goodness, you're going to ask that person? Do you think they're going to come to Lehman College? I mean, they're so, Lehman College is one of the colleges of City University. It's not a big deal like some of the other colleges. And I always thought, you're aiming so high. You're aiming so high. He said, no, he insisted. And he always got the person he asked.
Wow.
Always did.
That's awesome. That's incredible. You must have been really proud.
Yes. He was an educator, very, very wise, very intellectual. He loved music. He loved drama. He loved the arts. He had a very wide area of involvement in his life, and I was happy too. We were patrons of the Metropolitan Museum of Art for so many years, and whenever they had a new exhibit, their routine was to close the museum for an evening set aside for patrons. It was a black tie affair, and they would clear the lobby. They would set up little tables and put up a little bar, and then we all went to visit the new exhibit and then came back for the social hour.
Wow.
Yeah, it was he enjoyed many things in life, not just the work that he did, which he loved also.
And you were also patrons at the College Light Opera Company Theater locally here in Falmouth. And
over 40 years.
Over 40 years.
I'll tell you exactly. We started when Joan was 10, and she's, I don't want to tell her.
She's older than 10.
She's older than 10. Let me see. I'll tell you now how many years it was. It was 52 or 3 years that we have been going, and we've been patrons for most of that time.
And you've had those season tickets for
little by little,
years.
We ended up getting those tickets, yes.
Some of the best seats in the house.
Oh, yes.
And even when he passed away in 2005, I think it's worth mentioning that you have continued to keep those 2 seats. And I think you've managed to find a guest for every single show.
Well, you came to a good number of them. I'm so glad.
and I will continue to do so.
Great. And I will continue to have those tickets then.
Deal. Well, listen, I know you have to go play bridge, and I don't want to keep you, so thank you again for being here. This was an awesome conversation, and I think so valuable, not only to myself and our family, but to everyone out there. So thanks for having it.
You're very welcome.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.